In a small village, tucked away between rolling hills and winding paths, Lela lived a life defined by both hardship and hope. The village was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the whispers of neighbors were louder than the wind itself. It was a community bound by tradition, where wealth was measured by dowries, land, and lineage, and where one's status often determined their fate. Lela was beautiful, with dark eyes that sparkled with a quiet fire and long flowing hair that shimmered in the sun. But her beauty was the least of her worth in a world obsessed with material possessions. Born into a modest family, Lela had never known the comforts of luxury. Her father, once a proud man, had disappeared from her life when she was a child, leaving her to grow up under the watchful eyes of her stepmother, Zara. Zara was a woman of harsh words and even harsher actions. She ruled the household with an iron fist, constantly reminding Lela of her place. Lela was never good enough for Zara, never pretty enough, never rich enough. No matter how hard Lela tried to be kind or to please her stepmother, Zara always found something to criticize. "You're nothing but a burden," she'd often say, her voice dripping with disdain. "No dowry, no prospects. Who would want a girl like you?" These words stung Lela deeply, but they also fueled a quiet determination in her. Lela dreamed of escaping the cruelty that defined her days. She dreamed of finding a love that was not dictated by money or status, something pure, something real. But in a village where one's worth was weighed by wealth, that dream often felt like a distant fantasy. Her life was a constant struggle to prove herself worthy in a world that seemed to see her only for what she lacked. She watched as girls with larger dowries and grander names were courted by eligible bachelors, while she remained unnoticed. In her village, no one cared about the depth of her heart or the strength of her spirit. All that mattered was what was visible on the outside, what could be traded for status, what could be bought or sold. Yet despite the cruel circumstances, Lela refused to let her spirit be broken. Her dreams were her escape. Dreams of a life where love was enough, where a person's heart and soul held more value than the size of their dowry. She longed for a man who would see her not as an object to be bartered, but as someone to be loved. The village was a place where social status reigned, and Lela's lowly standing made her a target for judgment. But she held on to the hope that one day someone would see beyond her lack of wealth and discover the woman she truly was. That hope kept her going, even as she faced a future that seemed to offer little more than the same cruelty and oppression she had endured all her life. Lela's life took another turn when her stepmother Zara announced that an arrangement had been made for her marriage. Zara had found a match, a man named Jamil, from a neighboring village. He was described as humble and hard-working, with a reputation for being kind but poor. To Zara, the choice was simple. Lela had little to offer in terms of wealth or family connections, and marrying a man of modest means would rid her of the burden of caring for Lela. Zara believed Jamil, though poor, would provide some level of stability for the family, and at least Lela would be off her hands. Lela, however, felt a sinking weight in her chest. The idea of marriage to a stranger, especially one who was described as poor, was not something she had ever dreamed of. She had been raised to believe that her worth was tied to what she could bring to a marriage, a dowry, connections, status. But Jamil seemed to have none of these. Despite the unease swirling in her heart, she had little say in the matter. Zara was relentless, and her father's absence in her life left Lela with no protector or advocate. She had been taught to obey, and now that obedience led her into a life she had no choice but to accept. On the day Lela met Jamil, she was struck by his quiet demeanor. He was not the handsome, confident man she had imagined, but his warmth was undeniable. Jamil's eyes were soft, filled with a sincerity that was rare in the village. He had a gentle smile and spoke with a calmness that was both soothing and strange to Lela. She noticed his rough hands, calloused from hard work, and the simplicity of his clothes. No finery, no extravagant decorations. He was a man who had little, but there was something about him that made Lela hesitate. Lela could see that Jamil, despite his humble appearance, had a kindness in him. She felt an odd mixture of emotions. Apprehension, yes, but also a glimmer of hope. Could he, a man with so little to offer in terms of wealth, perhaps offer her something more? Could love blossom between them, even in such humble circumstances? The thought was both comforting and terrifying. She didn't know much about him, but a part of her longed for the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could find happiness despite the harsh circumstances of her life. Yet, in her heart, doubts lingered. Could she truly build a future with someone she barely knew? Someone who seemed so far removed from the life she had imagined for herself. The day of the wedding arrived, and Lela found herself caught between two conflicting emotions: nervousness and excitement. It felt surreal, like stepping into a story that didn't quite belong to her. She had spent her whole life dreaming of a marriage filled with love, and now here she was, marrying a man she barely knew, simply because fate, or rather her stepmother's arrangements, had decreed it. As she donned the simple bridal attire, her heart beat faster with each passing moment, unsure of what the future held. The ceremony itself was modest, devoid of the grand celebrations that Lela had once imagined. The village gathered, gossiping in hushed tones, eyes scanning the bride, waiting to see if the union would prove worthwhile. Her stepmother, Zara, stood with her arms crossed, a cold expression on her face. There was no warmth in her eyes, only a calculated satisfaction at having achieved what she wanted. Zara's indifference to the occasion contrasted sharply with Leila's nervous hope for something better. Mira, her stepsister, wore a look of quiet superiority, almost as if she were mocking the simplicity of it all. She didn't offer Lela any words of encouragement or congratulations. Instead, Mira's sharp eyes made it clear that she was above this whole spectacle. She had always resented Lela for being in the way of her own ambitions, and now, seeing her sister bound to a man of lesser means, a smirk played at the corner of her lips. Leila's heart longed for something more than this, something beyond duty and obligation. She had dreamed of a wedding filled with laughter, with family cheering, and a partner who loved her as much as she loved him. But this felt different. It was a quiet, emotionless affair, where love seemed like a distant echo. In the days that followed, the honeymoon period was both a blessing and a curse. Lela and Jamil settled into their modest home, a simple stone cottage on the outskirts of the village. At first, everything felt calm. Jamil was kind and attentive, his gentle nature offering Lela the comfort she had longed for. They shared meals, laughter, and moments of silence, but in those moments, Lela felt a strange sense of peace, the kind she never expected to find in an arranged marriage. But there were times, quiet and fleeting, when something didn't feel quite right. Jamil would become distant, retreating into himself, his eyes clouded with thoughts that Lela couldn't reach. When she tried to ask about his past, his responses were vague, and his demeanor closed off. There was a hidden sorrow in him, a shadow that he refused to share. It made Lela uneasy. There was warmth, yes, but also a wall between them that she couldn't quite breach. She couldn't help but wonder, what was it about Jamil's past that made him so guarded? Why did he never speak of where he came from, or who he truly was before their paths had crossed? As the days passed, the unease in Leila's heart grew steadily, feeding a curiosity that she could no longer ignore. Jamil, despite his kindness and the life they were building together, seemed determined to keep his past buried. Every time Lela tried to ask him about his childhood, his family, or his life before their marriage, Jamil would change the subject or offer vague answers. He would smile softly, but there was something guarded in his eyes, as though there were things he wasn't ready or willing to share. At first, Lela brushed it off, telling herself that it was normal for a man to keep some parts of his life private. But the more she observed him, the more she noticed inconsistencies in the little things he said. One moment he would speak of his family with great fondness. The next, his tone would shift, and the memories seemed to be tinged with pain. He spoke about his past relationships in a distant, almost detached way, never going into details, as if he didn't want to acknowledge them at all. The more Lela thought about it, the more these discrepancies nagged at her. She had never been one to question people's motives, but something about Jamil's reticence felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. It wasn't just the way he spoke, it was the way he avoided certain subjects altogether. There were moments when his eyes seemed to flicker with an unreadable emotion whenever her questions touched too close to home. Then came the strange occurrences. At first they were small things, nothing alarming, just odd enough to catch Leila's attention. One morning, while cleaning the house, she found a set of foreign stamps tucked away in the corner of a drawer. The stamps were old, worn at the edges, and seemed to belong to a different time and place. She wondered where Jamil could have gotten them, but when she asked him about them, he brushed it off, saying they were old letters from a friend who had travelled abroad. It seemed harmless, yet something about them lingered in her mind. As the days went on, Lela began to notice other strange things. Expensive-looking clothes hidden away in his wardrobe. Clothes that seemed far too luxurious for a man of his supposed means. There were fine fabrics, patterns that belonged to wealthy families, and accessories that were clearly out of place in their humble cottage. Lela couldn't help but wonder if Jamil had once been someone entirely different, someone wealthier, someone who no longer wanted to remember that part of his life. The most unsettling thing, however, were the strange phone calls. Sometimes, when Lela would be in the kitchen preparing dinner or tending to the fire, she would hear Jamil speaking in hushed tones, his voice low and urgent, his words inaudible. When he would hang up, he seemed more distant than usual, his face tense with an emotion Lela couldn't place. When she asked him about them, he would merely say it was nothing, a call from a distant relative perhaps, or a business matter that didn't concern her. Lela tried to shake off the growing sense of doubt, but it lingered, making it harder for her to focus on their life together. The more she thought about it, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit into a picture that didn't make sense. She had always trusted Jamil, believed in his warmth and kindness, but now she wasn't so sure. Could it be that he was hiding something from her? Something important? She couldn't help but wonder if his past, his true past, was catching up with him. The final push came when Zara visited one afternoon, her eyes scanning the cottage with an air of disapproval. Over tea, she casually remarked, "It must be nice to live such a peaceful life, but you do know that Jamil's financial situation isn't as simple as he says, don't you? I've heard things, strange things, about his family. He might be hiding more than just his past. You should be careful, Lela." The words hit Lela like a bolt of lightning. Zara's insinuations were not lost on her. She was implying that Jamil had something to hide. As much as Lela hated to admit it, she found herself doubting the man she had married. She had always known Zara to be manipulative, but perhaps there was some truth in what she said. What if Jamil wasn't the humble man he appeared to be? What if he was hiding something darker, something that could destroy the fragile peace they had built together? Leila's heart ached as she grappled with the growing suspicion that perhaps she had been wrong about him all along. One quiet afternoon, when Jamil was away on an errand in the neighbouring village, Lela found herself alone in their modest home. The silence felt heavier than usual, pressing on her thoughts as she tried to make sense of the strange occurrences that had been unfolding over the past few weeks. She could no longer ignore the gnawing curiosity that had been growing inside her. What was Jamil hiding? What was the truth behind the expensive clothes, the foreign stamps, the secretive phone calls? Lela had always prided herself on being a trusting person, but this situation felt different. Something was off. She couldn't shake the feeling that the man she had married wasn't entirely who he had claimed to be. With her heart pounding, she decided to search through Jamil's belongings. It was a decision she didn't make lightly, but the uncertainty was driving her to the edge. She started with his closet, running her fingers along the fabrics that didn't match the simple life they had built together. Her hands paused on a leather-bound box hidden behind a stack of old blankets. Lela hesitated, then opened it. Inside, she found a collection of old photographs, some yellowed with age, others still vibrant with life. As she flipped through them, her eyes fell upon one particular picture that stopped her in her tracks. It was a photograph of Jamil, looking younger, but unmistakably him. He was dressed in fine clothes, surrounded by people who exuded wealth and power. An elegantly dressed woman and man, likely his parents, and a group of other well-dressed individuals, all smiling in front of a grand estate. Lela's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the image. This was a world so far removed from the man she knew, a world of opulence and privilege that Jamil had never mentioned. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the image of this wealthy family with the humble man she had married. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but they only created more questions. Why had Jamil never spoken of his past? Why had he hidden this life from her? The discovery left Lela shaken. She had to know more. She couldn't live in the shadow of these unanswered questions any longer. When Jamil returned home later that day, Lela was waiting for him, her heart pounding in her chest. As soon as he stepped through the door, she confronted him, the photograph still clutched tightly in her hand. "Jamil, we need to talk," Lela said, her voice trembling but firm. "I found something about your past. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you ever say anything?" Jamil's face went pale as he saw the photograph in her hands. For a moment, he said nothing, his eyes avoiding hers, as though the weight of his secrets was too much to bear. Finally, he took a deep breath and sat down beside her. "I didn't want you to know," he said softly, his voice heavy with regret. "I didn't want you to marry me because of my past or because of what I used to have. I wanted you to love me for who I am now, just a man with nothing but his own hands and heart to offer." Lela stared at him, still unable to fully comprehend what he was saying. "But who were you, Jamil? Who were you before all of this?" Jamil sighed, his eyes distant as he leaned back in his chair, clearly struggling to find the right words. "I came from a wealthy family, Lela. My father was a powerful businessman, and my mother was a socialite. We lived in luxury. Everything we wanted, we got. But it was all built on a lie. My mother, she was involved in illegal activities, criminal enterprises that, in the end, ruined everything. When it all came crashing down, I was caught in the middle. My family disowned me, forced me to leave everything behind. The shame was too great. They cut me off completely." Lela listened in stunned silence as Jamil continued, his voice trembling with the weight of his confession. "I didn't want you to see me as part of that world. I didn't want you to think I was still connected to them, still tainted by their corruption. So I left it all behind. I chose to live a simple life, away from the lies and the wealth. But even in that simplicity, I couldn't escape the ghosts of my past." Tears filled Lela's eyes as she processed the depth of what Jamil had just shared. The man she had married, this quiet, humble man, had once lived a life filled with unimaginable wealth and privilege, only to lose it all because of his family's criminal activities. The betrayal, the lies, and the shame had forced him to sever all ties with them, choosing a life of simplicity and secrecy instead. "I never wanted you to be a part of that," Jamil whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "I just wanted to be loved for who I am now, not for the man I used to be." Lela reached out, taking his hand in hers, her heart aching with compassion for the man she had married. The truth was more complicated than she had ever imagined, But in that moment, she understood. Jamil had never wanted to hide his past out of malice. He had wanted to protect her from it, to shield her from the darkness that had once consumed his life. As the truth sank in, Lela felt a wave of understanding wash over her. She could see the pain in Jamil's eyes, the weight of the past that he had carried alone for so long. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Lela knew that they could face it together, now that the truth was finally out in the open. Layla's world had already shifted dramatically with the revelations about Jamil's past, but nothing could have prepared her for the truth she was about to uncover about her stepmother, Zara. The more she thought about everything that had happened, the strange occurrences, the suspicious behavior, the manipulations, something didn't sit right. Why had Zara been so cold about the wedding, so indifferent to Layla's happiness, and so quick to push her into this union? The more Lela reflected on it, the clearer the picture became. One evening, while going through some old papers in the house, Lela stumbled across a letter, one that was meant for Zara but had somehow ended up misplaced in the bottom of a drawer. It was addressed to a business associate from the city, written in a tone that felt strangely familiar. As Lela read it, her heart sank. The letter was filled with details about Jamil's family and their once powerful position in society. Zahra had known about Jamil's background all along. She had known he came from wealth, that his family had been influential, and that his past had a shadow of scandal. But instead of feeling sympathy for him, Zahra had seen an opportunity. She hadn't arranged the marriage out of kindness or concern for Layla's well-being. She had done it to manipulate Jamil back into her own social circle. Zahra had planned to use her daughter as a pawn, hoping to get closer to Jamil's family in order to regain the influence and wealth she had lost long ago. The realization hit Lela like a punch to the gut. Zahra had never wanted her to find true happiness. She had never cared about Layla's feelings or desires, only about securing her own future. The cruelty that had always seemed to linger in Zahra's actions now made sense. Lela had always felt like something was off about her stepmother's cold demeanor, but she never imagined Zahra could be so calculating, so desperate for status and control. But the betrayal didn't stop there. As Layla's mind raced through everything she had learned, it hit her. Mira, her stepsister, had known all along. The sly glances, the mocking comments, the hidden smirks, they all pointed to the same conclusion. Mira had been fully aware of Jamil's wealthy background and had secretly hoped to marry him herself. The realization stung, but it made sense. Mira had always believed herself to be the superior one, the one who deserved better, and she saw Jamil as a way to secure that power. Layla's suspicions were confirmed when, one day, Mira confronted her, her jealousy simmering beneath the surface. "You think Jamil is a good match for you?" She scoffed, her eyes flashing with disdain. "You really think he's worth your time? He's hiding something, and you're too blind to see it." Mira's venomous words were meant to undermine Layla's growing trust in Jamil, to convince her that he wasn't worthy of her affection. But Layla saw through it now. It wasn't about Jamil at all. It was about Mira's jealousy, her resentment that Layla had something she never could have. Mira had always wanted the life that Layla was now building with Jamil, and she couldn't stand the thought of her stepsister finding happiness. Layla's heart broke as she began to understand the full extent of the manipulation that had surrounded her. Her family had tried to control her life, to shape her future based on their own selfish desires. Zahra had never cared for her, and Mira had only been plotting her own selfish ambitions. The realization that the people she had trusted most were the very ones trying to pull the strings of her fate was devastating. Yet, in that moment, Lela knew what she had to do. She had to take control of her life, make her own decisions, and stop allowing others to dictate her future. The truth had come at a high price, but it had set her free. The tension in Layla's heart had been building for days, fueled by the painful revelations about her stepmother and stepsister. She couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to confront Zara and Mira. Her blood boiled at the thought of their manipulation, their lies, and the way they had attempted to control her life. But most of all, she was angry at herself for not seeing through their schemes sooner. It was a late afternoon when the storm finally broke. Zara was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, her back turned as Lela walked in, her heart heavy but determined. Mira, of course, was sitting nearby, her usual smug expression plastered on her face. As soon as Lela entered, Zara's stiff posture made it clear that something was about to happen. "I know everything," Lela said, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and hurt. "About Jamil, about his past, about what you've been doing." Zara didn't flinch. She turned slowly, her eyes narrowing as if she had been expecting this moment. Mira shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flicking nervously between the two women. Lela felt her blood boil as Zara's face twisted into something unrecognizable. A cruel, cold expression that she had never seen before. "You think I don't know what you've been doing?" Lela continued, her voice rising. "Arranging my marriage to Jamil not because of who he is, but because of what you thought he could give you, wealth, power, connections. You wanted me to marry him, not because you cared for me, but because you wanted to use him. You wanted to use me." Zara laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that made Layla's blood run cold. "You've always been so naive, haven't you, Lela?" she sneered. "I never cared about you. You were always just a means to an end, a burden. I never wanted a daughter. I wanted security, a future. Do you think I would have let you marry anyone less than Jamil, given his connections? He's your ticket to everything I've ever wanted." Layla's chest tightened with each word. The woman who had raised her, who had, in her own way, been a mother figure, had never cared for her. She had only seen Lela as a tool to manipulate, to climb back up the social ladder. The truth stung more than she had ever imagined. But it wasn't over. Zara wasn't finished. "You're nothing but a pawn in my game," Zara continued, her voice dripping with venom. "And you, Lela, you never had the strength to see it." Mira chimed in, trying to mask her jealousy with feigned concern. "You're so blinded by love, Lela, don't you see? Jamil's past is too messy. He'll drag you down with him. You're better off without him. He's not worthy of you." Layla's heart cracked at the sound of Mira's words. Her own sister, someone who had been by her side all these years, had been playing the same game as Zara. It was a betrayal so deep, Lela didn't know if she could ever recover from it. But just as she felt herself spiraling, Jamil walked into the room, his presence commanding the space. He had heard everything. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Lela turned to him, her chest tightening. Jamil's face was pale, his eyes filled with an unreadable emotion. "I've heard enough," Jamil said, his voice firm but tinged with a quiet sadness. "I can't stand by and let you destroy everything, Lela. I didn't want you to know about my past, but I thought we could build something together. I never wanted you to marry me for my past, only for who I am now. But now I see what your family really thinks of me. They never wanted me for who I am. They only wanted me for what they thought I could give them." He looked at Zara, his gaze hardening. "And you've manipulated my wife, used her to get to me. I should have seen this sooner, but I didn't. I can't stand by and let this continue." Layla's heart was torn in two. Jamil was standing before her, fighting for her, while her own family, the people who were supposed to love her, were exposing their true selves. Jamil's eyes met Layla's, and in that moment, he gave her an ultimatum, an impossible choice. "Lela, I love you, but I can't live in a world of lies. You have to choose. If you want to be with me, you have to accept all of me, including my past. If you can't, I understand, but I won't stay in a relationship where I'm being used, where I'm being torn apart by your family's expectations." Layla's chest tightened, her thoughts racing. She loved Jamil, she truly did, but her family, her blood, the people who were supposed to be her support system, were betraying her in ways she couldn't even fathom. How could she choose between the man she loved and the family she had known all her life? How could she leave the only family she had ever known, especially when they had made her feel so small, so unworthy for so long? She looked at Jamil, then at her stepmother and stepsister, the two people who had controlled so much of her life. The weight of the decision seemed to crush her. Could she abandon everything she had known, step into the unknown with Jamil, and fight for a future built on trust and honesty? Tears welled in her eyes as she took a deep breath. She knew what she had to do. Lela stood there, caught between her past and her future, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision she had to make. The room around her seemed to spin, the faces of Zara and Mira distorting as the reality of what they had done sank in. Their cruelty, their manipulation had been exposed in the harshest of ways. But the man she loved, Jamil, was standing before her, vulnerable, waiting for her choice. And that choice was no longer about love alone. It was about trust, truth, and breaking free from the chains that had held her for so long. Her eyes flickered between Jamil and her family, and her thoughts raced. She could stay with them, live a life of comfort and familiarity. But that life would always be tainted by lies, deceit, and manipulation. Zara's coldness, Mira's jealousy, and the betrayal that had simmered beneath the surface for so long were now impossible to ignore. Could she live with herself if she chose that life, knowing the price of her silence? And then there was Jamil. He had already given her everything: his honesty, his vulnerability, his love. He had trusted her with his past, a past that had caused him so much pain, and in return, she had to make the hardest decision of her life. Could she walk away from the one person who had shown her true kindness? Could she stand by a family that had never seen her as anything more than a pawn? The answer became clear. "I choose you, Jamil," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I choose a life with you. I don't care about your past. I don't care about the wealth or the status you once had. What matters to me is who you are now, the man who has been kind to me, who has loved me for who I am. I don't want to be part of a family that sees me as a means to an end. I want to build a life with you, one that's real and full of honesty." Tears welled in her eyes as she stepped forward and took his hand, her heart finally at peace with the decision she had made. The pain of leaving her family behind was immense, but she knew it was the right thing to do. She had to stand on her own 2 feet, make her own choices, and live her life on her own terms. Jamil looked at her, his eyes softening with relief and love. He squeezed her hand, pulling her into an embrace. "You've made me the happiest man alive, Lela. I promise you, we'll build a life together, a life of honesty and love." But just as they began to believe they had overcome the greatest obstacle, something shifted in the room. Lela heard a soft shuffle of feet, a cough, then a voice, strained but clear, came from behind her. It was Mira. "You think you've won?" Mira's voice was icy, laced with bitterness. "You really think Jamil is your happily ever after? You have no idea what's coming for you." Lela turned, startled, but saw nothing but the cruel glint in her stepsister's eyes. She felt a chill run down her spine. Mira was not one to let go easily. "What are you talking about?" Lela demanded, her voice hardening. "You've lost. Your plans have failed." Mira stepped forward, her expression twisting into something darker. "You don't know everything, Lela. You think you've escaped your past, that you've chosen a clean future. But you're wrong. You've just walked into a far worse nightmare." Jamil stepped forward, his face tense. "What do you mean?" Mira smirked, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Jamil's family didn't just cut ties with him because of a scandal. No, that's not the whole story. You see, Jamil isn't the only one running from his past. His family was involved in something much darker, something that's not over yet. And they're coming for you, Lela. They won't just let you go, not without a price." Leila's blood ran cold as Mira's words settled in. A sudden realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Jamil had been running from something far bigger than he had ever let on. His family's involvement in illegal activities was only the surface of a deeper, far more dangerous story. Lela turned to Jamil, her voice trembling with shock. "Jamil? What is she talking about? What's happening?" Jamil's expression darkened, and for the first time, Lela saw the true weight of the fear in his eyes. "I didn't want you to know, Lela. I didn't want to drag you into this. But Mira's right. My family's criminal dealings. They're not done with me yet. They will never let me go, not until they've used me up completely." Lela felt a rush of panic, but she gripped Jamil's hand, refusing to let the fear take control. They had already faced betrayal, deception, and cruelty. Now they would face the darkness together. And in that moment, Lela made another choice. "We will face them," she said, her voice steady, despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "We'll face whatever comes, Jamil. We'll face it together." But as Mira's ominous warning echoed in the silence, Lela realized that their battle hadn't